The second section of this chapter is called The Many Forms of Protestantism. In this section, we'll kind of see how Luther's ideas branch off into subcategories. Protestants gained their name because Lutherans were known for protesting the Catholic Church and the authority of Charles V. So this term was then later applied to a much wider range of dissenting forms of Christianity. It was no longer just used for Lutherans. It was really a lot easier for Protestantism to thrive in Switzerland, mainly because in the early 16th century, the prosperous cities were mainly independent rather than being ruled by kings or territorial princes. So when people of Swiss municipality decided they wanted to shift over to Protestantism, no one could really stop them from doing it. And from this emerged three main forms of Protestantism, that is Zwinglianism, Anabaptism, and Calvinism. Ulrich Zwingli was the founder of Zwinglianism. He was a priest and had a humanist study, and his humanist study I was actually able to convince him that Catholic theology and practice was going against the Bible. So with this in mind, Zwingli began attacking the authority of Rome, and many people in northern Switzerland actually accepted his religious leadership and went along with him to follow him. And he differed from Luther's beliefs on the Eucharist. Zwingli saw the Eucharist simply as a reenactment, whereas Luther didn't. Zwingli eventually died, and when he did, John Calvin took over his movement, and John was a lot more systematic with his ways than Zwingli was. Anabaptism actually broke off of Zwingli's ideas, and they originally broke off over the issue of infant baptism. So they believed that baptism only really worked if people understood what it meant. And so because of this, they kind of required their followers to get rebaptized whenever they became adults. And so that was the reason for breaking off. But then we also see them start to differ in other areas as well. And one of these areas is that these Anabaptists rejected the view of the church as a single body to which all members of society belonged at birth. So because of this harsh idea, Anabaptism was actually rejected by all established powers. This includes the Catholic Church and Protestants. Some Anabaptists became extremists, and in 1534 they actually gained a German city of Munster, and these extremists were really driven and motivated by the belief that God really wanted to institute a new order of justice and spirituality before the end of time. And so because of this belief, they attempted to change Munster into a new Jerusalem. Under the Anabaptist extreme leader, religious practices grew mandatory. Private property was abolished, and even polygamy was permitted based on the Old Testament precedents. As I had mentioned, neither Catholics or Protestants were really fond of these Anabaptists. And a little more than a year after the Anabaptists took over Munster, Catholic forces came in and captured it back. And these Catholics killed David and his top two lieutenants by torture, and then their three bodies were actually displayed in cages in the town square. And I believe these cages are still there today, just without the bodies, obviously. Calvin had originally gone to law school, but we soon find that he became a Protestant theologian and fled to Switzerland. He published his Institutes of the Christian Religion, and this became the most influential formulation of Protestant theology ever written. Calvin resolved institutes to set forth all the principles of Protestantism comprehensively, logically, and systematically. And Calvin believed that the entire universe depended on the will of the Almighty, who knows all things present and to come. And Calvin felt that because of man's original fall from grace, that human beings were just sinners, and that for some reason, God predestined some for eternal salvation and damned the rest to hell. And Calvin felt that there is nothing that individuals could do to alter this fate that God predestined for them. Luther and Calvin actually had a few different beliefs. Luther thought that a Christian should endure the trials of this life through suffering, but Calvin thought the world was to be mastered through unceasing labor for God's sake. Luther insisted that members attended church on Sunday, but he really didn't care what they did with the rest of their day, while Calvin demanded that his followers refrained from all pleasure or work on Sundays. Luther retained many features of traditional Christian worship, including altars, music, and ritual, while Calvin rejected everything that was smacked of popery. These are just a few of the differences these two had. Calvin immediately began preaching and organizing after he moved to Geneva in 1536. He faced a little resistance at first, but eventually he was able to bring the city council under his sway. With Calvin's guidance, Geneva's government became a theocracy, and the supreme authority was vested in a consistory, and this consistory was composed of 12 lay elders and pastors. They had weekly meetings, and their main function was to supervise morality, both public and private. Calvin's Geneva was a beacon of light to thousands of Protestants throughout Europe in the mid-16th century. One of Calvin's disciples, John Knox, declared Geneva the most perfect school of Christ that ever was on earth since the days of the apostles. Converts flocked to Geneva for refuge or instruction, and then they would return home to become ardent Protestantizers for their new religion. Geneva became the center of an international movement dedicated to spreading Reformed religion to France and the rest of Europe through organized missionary activity and propaganda. Less than a generation after Luther's challenge to the church, wars between Catholic and Protestant rulers began. In Germany, Charles V wanted to establish Catholic unity, and he tried to do this by launching military campaigns against several of the German princes who had instituted Lutheran worship in their territories. He did have a few notable victories, but his efforts to defeat them ultimately failed. Charles was also involved in wars against France, and Catholic princes of Germany worked against him because they feared that any suppression of Protestant princes might diminish their own independence. And so, as a result, the Catholic princes' support for their foreign-born Charles was really only lukewarm, and at times they even joined with the Protestants in a battle against him. This warfare sputtered on until 1555, when a compromise was reached via the Peace of Augsburg. And in this Peace of Augsburg, the governing principle was, as the ruler, so the religion. And this meant that if in the territory Lutherans ruled, then Lutheranism would be the sole state religion. But where Catholics ruled, the people of their territories should practice Catholicism. In some regions, this rule was not needed or even enforced because the local rulers there permitted religious diversity. The Peace of Augsburg was a huge milestone because for the first time since Luther had been excommunicated, these Catholic rulers were forced to acknowledge the legality of Protestantism. Yet the peace kind of set a dangerous precedent at the same time because it established the premise that no sovereign state can tolerate religious diversity. And moreover, it excluded Calvinism entirely and thus spurred aggressiveness. As a result, Europe was riven by religious warfare for another century and exported sectarian violence to the New World.